It was the kind of fog that dulls the edges of the world, thick, damp, and old, as if it had risen not from the ground, but from memory itself. On that peculiar Thursday morning in Hampstead, the lamps flickered hesitantly along Denholm Terrace, unsure whether their light was still welcome. The postman, who made his rounds with the mechanical diligence of a man who had stopped caring for what he delivered, paused at number 8. He did not notice the letter. No one did. It had no stamp, no return address, no markings, only a name written in a firm, unfamiliar hand, Miss Jane Marple. The house belonged to Margaret Denholm, a quiet widow with too many rooms and too few visitors. She had invited Miss Marple, her distant cousin by marriage, to stay for a few weeks while recovering from a mild illness. But the invitation, though polite, had carried a strange undertone, one that now, in light of the envelope sitting on the hallway console table, felt less like a courtesy and more like a silent warning. Miss Marple found the envelope after breakfast. It was too crisp to be old, too deliberately placed to be forgotten. She opened it with the caution of someone who had seen far too many polite surfaces peel back into terrible truths. Inside, a single card. No greeting, no signature. Just 10 handwritten words. He is not buried. He is not finished. Come outside. She said nothing to Margaret, who sat in the parlor leafing absently through a newspaper she wasn't reading. Miss Marple simply stood, slipped the card into her handbag, and made her way quietly into the garden at the back of the house, the one Margaret never entered. The garden was strangely still, as though it too were waiting. Brambles clung like secrets to the stone wall that bordered it, and the gate at the far end, old and iron-barred, was sealed tight with rust and old paint. Yet something was different now. The latch had been disturbed. The earth beneath it, muddy from last night's rain, bore the faintest impression of a footprint. She looked down. It was not a recent print, but it was not old either. A man's boot, narrow, with a slightly worn heel. Not Margaret's. Not the gardener's. Someone had been here. Miss Marple turned slowly and looked back at the house. The curtains on the top floor swayed slightly, as if someone had just stepped away. Inside, Margaret Denholm sat frozen, her hand on her teacup, her eyes, unfocused, stared at the hearth. Miss Marple knew that look. She had seen it many times before. It was the look of someone who had heard the past knocking. The gate had not been opened in 20 years. And yet, last night, someone had come through. Not to break in, but to return. And the letter? That had not been a message. It had been a summons. The rain began in silence, an indecisive drizzle that painted the window panes in long vertical strokes. Miss Marple stood just inside the glass door of the conservatory, watching the back garden. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just waiting, as she always did, for the pattern to begin revealing itself. And indeed, something had shifted. Not in the weather. In the house. At breakfast, Margaret had been unusually quiet, her spoon lingering above her porridge until it grew cold. Her eyes, always a shade too heavy with memory, had avoided Miss Marple's entirely. Something inside her had stirred, and it wasn't grief. It was recognition. Miss Marple waited until Ruby, the young housemaid, had cleared the dishes before speaking. "Margaret," she said gently, "was that gate ever used? The one at the bottom of the garden?" The question struck its target with uncanny precision. Margaret blinked, as if woken suddenly. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup. "No," she replied. "Not since James died. It was locked. Rusted shut, really. Why do you ask?" "There were prints," Miss Marple said quietly. "Fresh enough to trouble me." Margaret looked down at her lap. "I suppose I ought to have told you," she said after a pause. "There was someone outside last week. I didn't see him clearly. Just a figure. I told myself it was the postman. He sometimes cuts through the alley." "But the alley doesn't reach the gate," Miss Marple murmured. "It stops 3 houses down." Margaret said nothing. She looked instead at the fireplace, where the morning logs burned low and quiet. Her fingers were twisted tightly in her handkerchief. "I dreamt of James last night," she said. "He was wearing his uniform, standing by the gate. But it wasn't the James the first remembered. It was older, tired, watching me like I was the ghost." Miss Marple didn't answer. Dreams, in her experience, were often conversations memory chose to finish when reality refused. But this was no dream. Not entirely. Later that day, as the sun strained weakly through the fog, Ruby approached Miss Marple in the corridor near the stair. Her voice was low, her expression shy. "Ma'am, I think I should tell you something. I was out back yesterday, hanging up the laundry. I saw someone, just beyond the hedges. A man. I didn't recognize him." Miss Marple turned to face her. "And what was he doing?" "Standing still," Ruby replied. "Like he was listening. Not watching me, just listening. Like the trees were saying something only he could hear." "Was he tall?" "Yes. Tall, and still like a statue. It frightened me, ma'am." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Thank you, Ruby. That was brave." That evening, when Margaret retired early and Ruby had gone to her room, Miss Marple stepped once more into the garden. The air was colder now, full of scentless damp and muffled earth. She made her way carefully to the gate, her boots brushing against brittle leaves and sodden grass. The lock had rusted, yes, but not enough to prevent it being lifted. She placed her gloved fingers on the handle and pressed down. It clicked. Beyond the gate, the alley ran into a thicket of old hedgerows and brambles. There was no light, only shapes. But one thing was certain. Someone had passed through here. Not hurriedly, not hiding, as if returning to a place they once belonged. Miss Marple's breath rose in soft clouds. A single thought arrived with clarity. The man had not come to intrude. He had come home. And somewhere inside the Denholm house, Margaret was remembering exactly what that meant, but hadn't yet found the words to say it. The next morning broke with a fragile kind of light, the kind that doesn't brighten but merely reveals. Fog still clung to the edges of Denholm Terrace, softening the lines of rooftops and hedges. Inside the house, however, the light did not reach far. Miss Marple awoke early, as she always did, and dressed with quiet precision. Something in her bones told her this would be a day of small revelations. She found Ruby in the dining room, laying the table with careful, mechanical movements. The girl looked pale, her eyes still tethered to whatever had unsettled her the day before. Miss Marple greeted her gently, then crossed to the sideboard where a row of old photographs sat behind glass. She had glanced at them many times, but today one caught her eye. It was a group portrait, James Denholm in uniform, seated beside Margaret on a garden bench. Between them stood a child, not more than 6 or 7, his face half turned from the camera, one hand clutching a small toy soldier. It was not the boy that struck Miss Marple. It was the photograph itself. The photo had not been there yesterday. She turned. "Ruby, forgive me, but has this picture always been here?" Ruby's brow furrowed. "No, ma'am. I don't think so. I dusted that sideboard yesterday morning. There were only 4 frames. This one's new." Miss Marple studied it again. The frame was older than the others, wooden, slightly chipped at the corners. Yet the glass was clean, recently polished. And beneath the edge of the frame, tucked barely inside, was a folded scrap of paper. She slipped it free. Just a single line, handwritten in faded blue ink. "I was never meant to disappear." Miss Marple folded the paper and slid it into her handbag, without comment. Ruby's eyes followed her nervously. "That child?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Do you know who he was?" Ruby shook her head. "I've never seen a photo with James as a father. Miss Margaret never talks about him like that." "No," Miss Marple said, half to herself, because perhaps she was never told. She excused herself and climbed the stairs slowly, deliberately. The room at the end of the corridor, the one Margaret had never opened, remained locked. But there was a key now. Not in a drawer. Not on a hook. It had been left on the small table beside the vase of chrysanthemums, right outside the door. As if someone had decided it was time. Margaret was in her bedroom, seated upright in a chair by the window, staring out at the morning fog. She did not turn when Miss Marple entered. "Did you know someone placed a new photo in the parlor?" Miss Marple asked softly. Margaret said nothing at first. Then, in a voice dry with age and memory, "I wondered when it would show up." "So you've seen it before?" "I burned it. Years ago. Or thought I had." Miss Marple approached slowly. Who is the child? Margaret's fingers gripped the armrest. He wasn't mine. And yet, he was all I had left of James. She brought him once. The mother, only once, said she couldn't keep him. Said it was James's. But James was already gone. What did you do? I paid her, Margaret said quietly, to disappear. And she did. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. But not the child. No, Margaret whispered. He came back. He came here. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. And now, perhaps, so has he again. The silence in the room was dense, not empty, but full of years unsaid, of guilt folded like linen and stored in the dark. Later that morning, as the clock struck 10, Miss Marple returned to the photograph. She steadied the toy soldier in the boy's hand. The paint was chipped, one leg slightly bent, the same soldier Ruby had described as missing from the locked box in James's room. A toy, a photograph, a note. These were not messages. They were memories, resurfacing one by one, like bubbles rising from the depth of a long-stilled pond. And Miss Marple knew this much already. Whatever had returned to Denholm House wasn't just seeking revenge. It was seeking its name. The fog lingered longer that morning, curling between the branches of the trees and hugging the hedges like a visitor unwilling to leave. Denholm House sat quietly within it, almost unsure whether to breathe. The kitchen clock ticked faintly, and from somewhere in the distance, the low sound of a train whistle dissolved into the mist. Miss Marple stood near the back window, teacup in hand, watching the narrow path that led from the garden gate to the orchard. A shape stood just beyond the iron bars. A man. She had seen him once before, barely a silhouette. But now, in the weak light of late morning, he was clearer. Tall, lean, perhaps in his 40s. A long coat, a satchel held close to his side. And though he did not move, there was no sense of stillness about him. He gave the impression of waiting, not with urgency, but with familiarity, as if this place had once been his, and he'd returned not to ask entry, but to see if the house remembered him. Miss Marple set her cup down and slipped on her cardigan. She passed Ruby in the hall without a word. The girl opened her mouth to speak, but seemed to think better of it. Outside, the air was thick and damp, the stones cold beneath her feet. When she reached the gate, the man looked at her, not startled, but almost relieved. "You're Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and unhurried. "I am," she replied, studying him. "And you are?" He hesitated. "I'm staying at the boarding house on Redfern Street, number 12. I've only just arrived." "And yet you seem very familiar with this garden." His lips curved into something not quite a smile. "I grew up around places like this." "Most people did," Miss Marple said gently. "But not most people return to look through iron gates." He lowered his eyes. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You haven't," she said. "But people around here are easily disturbed by ghosts that come walking in daylight." He looked up sharply. "Is that what they think I am?" "No," Miss Marple said. "That's what they hope you're not." He nodded. "May I ask you something?" She gestured slightly with her hand. "Of course. Does the name Denholm mean anything to you?" "Why do you ask?" "Because I think it might be mine," he said, and then after a moment, "Or at least, it should have been." Miss Marple felt the chill settle not in the air, but in her chest. The voice was steady, unaccusing, but there was a weight in the words that could only have come from years of being unspoken. She unlocked the gate. The man stepped forward, not eagerly, but with care, like someone stepping back into a room they had once fled from. Inside the house, Margaret did not come down when Ruby announced the visitor. Miss Marple did not insist. Instead, she brought the man to the study, now rarely used, and poured him tea that neither of them touched. "My mother," he began, "worked in the city. We moved often. She told me very little, only that my father had died in the war, that his name was James, that his family didn't want me." Miss Marple listened without interruption. "I found the name Denholm on an envelope she kept. A return address. This house. She died last spring. That's when I started looking." "And what did you hope to find here?" "A place where I began," he said simply. Does anyone know you're here? No. I haven't spoken to anyone but the landlady. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. And your name? He hesitated again, then said, Edwin. Edwin Longmore. But that was his name, not mine. The man who raised me. She nodded slowly. And do you have anything of your father's? He reached into his coat and produced a small, rusted object, wrapped in cloth. He placed it gently on the table and unfolded it. A tin soldier, bent at the leg, paint-chipped. Miss Marple stared at it in silence. The very one Ruby had seen, the very one from the photograph. Not a memory, not a metaphor, a fact. I didn't come to cause trouble, Edwin said softly. I just wanted to know whether the story I was told all my life was true. Miss Marple finally met his gaze. It was a story crafted to keep pain from spreading. But truth, you see, spreads all the same. Later that afternoon, after Edwin had left, promising to return the next day, Miss Marple stood by the fireplace and held the tin soldier in her palm. It was heavier than it looked, not in weight, but in consequence. Upstairs, Margaret's bedroom remained closed. But Miss Marple sensed the moment was coming when every locked room in this house, literal and otherwise, would have to be opened. The past, after all, had come home, and it wasn't leaving quietly. The fog that had hovered over Denholm Terrace for days did not lift. It thickened. It clung to the windows like breath from something too old to speak. Inside the house, time had slowed. Clocks ticked, but their rhythm felt uncertain, as though even they had begun to listen. Miss Marple sat quietly in the parlor, the tin soldier placed beside her teacup on the side table. Margaret Denholm had not yet come down. Ruby moved softly around the kitchen, speaking little, her usual cheer dimmed by the weight of something unspoken. And in the hearth, low flames licked at crumbling paper, slowly consuming what had once been private. It was by chance, or instinct, that Miss Marple noticed it. A scrap of paper caught in the grate, half-burnt, curled like a leaf turned in autumn. With the tongs, she pulled it free. Most of the words were lost, but a few lingered in faded ink. She'd never have told him he's come for more. Denholm, undeserved. That evening, she walked to number 12, Redfern Street. The boarding house was small and stooped, its windows flickering with gaslight. Edwin Longmore opened the door himself. He looked older than he had the day before. Not in body, but in bearing, as though the closer he stepped toward the truth, the heavier it became. I didn't expect you to come here, he said quietly. I imagine there's much that wasn't expected, Miss Marple replied, stepping inside. They sat in the small drawing room. He offered her tea, which she declined. Silence passed between them, not uncomfortable, but wary. You were right, Edwin said finally. He followed me. Your stepfather? Yes. I hadn't seen him in years. Not since I left at 17. But when I began writing letters, looking into my father's name, he showed up. One morning, at my door, as if summoned by curiosity. But it wasn't curiosity, Miss Marple. It was fear. Fear of what? Of being found out. Of losing control. Miss Marple listened carefully. He knew about James Denholm, didn't he? He did. And he knew what it meant if I came here. That I might ask questions. That I might be answered. Edwin stood and crossed the room, opened a drawer, and returned with a letter. He handed it to her. The edges were torn, the paper creased. The handwriting was unfamiliar. I found this in his coat, Edwin said. After. The letter was brief. No salutation. Only the final sentence had not faded. If the boy returns, remember what we buried. The medals. The soldier. The name. Miss Marple folded it and slipped it back into its envelope. The room had cooled, or perhaps the chill had entered through the conversation. He came here to silence you, she said softly. I believe so. He came to threaten me, to tell me to stop digging. But I couldn't. And the night he died. Edwin's gaze darkened. I didn't hurt him. I left the house before he did. He followed me. I walked toward Denholm Terrace, hoping to speak with Margaret. But I never made it. I turned back. I was afraid. Miss Marple placed a hand on the letter, steadying it. You were afraid, she said. Not of him, but of what he could still do to you. He nodded once, the motion small and tired. Back at Denholm House, Margaret was sitting at the dining table, unmoving. The news had reached her. Ruby, tearfully, had told her that something had been burned, that someone had been here, that the boy, no longer a boy, had returned. Miss Marple entered without knocking. She carried the tin soldier and the letter. She said nothing at first, only sat opposite the woman whose silence had lasted decades. He brought nothing with him, she said gently, except this. She placed the soldier on the table. Margaret stared at it, and then, without speaking, she reached forward and touched it with her fingertips. Slowly, like recognizing a memory through touch alone. James gave that to him, she said, barely above a whisper, when he was only a year old. Miss Marple waited. He was mine, but they told me not to say it, said it would ruin the name, said James was gone, and the war had taken enough. And so you let the child go. Margaret's shoulders trembled. I was told he would be cared for, that he would never know. But I knew. Every day. Miss Marple reached across and gently took her hand. Now he knows too, she said, and the man who tried to erase him is no longer here. The room held its breath for a long moment. Finally, Margaret whispered, "Then maybe it's time I opened the door again." Outside, the fog was thick once more, curling like smoke around the gate. But within Denholm House, something had shifted. Not vanished, but shifted. A mother had remembered. A son had returned. And the tin soldier stood upright once again. The rain returned that evening, not hard, but persistent. A soft tapping on the windows like someone waiting to be let in. Inside Denholm House, the air had begun to settle, though not entirely. Some silences are not erased by confession. They wait instead for what comes after. Margaret had retired early, her face drawn but calmer, her hands no longer trembling when she touched the soldier on the mantel. Ruby moved through the house with unusual care, laying out supper with the reverence of someone preparing a meal not just for the living, but for the past as well. Miss Marple sat beside the fire, her knitting idle in her lap. Her thoughts had begun to coalesce, not into accusation, but into pattern. And like all patterns, this one was beginning to show its missing threads. The following morning brought with it a strange light, neither golden nor gray, but something in between, a sort of clarity disguised as haze. Miss Marple took her tea by the back window and watched the garden. Mr. Albee was there again, trimming back frost-bitten leaves with more force than necessary. His movements lacked the rhythm of labor and had taken on the nervous twitch of a man who had too long avoided his own memory. She waited until he paused, then stepped out, her boots soft on the wet earth. "It's odd," she said conversationally, "how plants can be coaxed to forget winter, if trimmed just right." Albee didn't look up. "Some things shouldn't come back," he said. "But they do," she replied gently, "even when we bury them deep." He stood then, wiping his hands on a cloth already dark with soil. "You know." "I suspect," Miss Marple said, "but I'd prefer to hear it from you." Albee looked at the apple tree by the stone wall. "It was him," he said after a long pause. "The man who died. Alfred Longmore. I knew him from before, when he used to come around the boy's house. He wasn't kind, and he didn't raise Edwin out of charity. He came here looking for something," Miss Marple said. Albee nodded. "He wanted money. Or silence. Maybe both. I saw them talking at the gate that evening. I was at the shed just there." He pointed to the corner where a rusted watering can lay tipped. "I heard him say the boy had no right, that this place would never be his." "And then?" she asked. Albee hesitated. "Then he said something about Miss Margaret, about what she'd done. It was cruel. Edwin tried to walk away, but the man grabbed his arm. I was too far to stop it, but I ran toward them. I shouted. He turned and he didn't fall because I pushed him. I just meant to pull them apart. But he stumbled, hit the stones." Miss Marple placed a hand lightly on his arm. "It wasn't murder," she said. "It was a moment too long unspoken. It was history catching up to itself." Albee looked away. "I carried him," he said quietly, "dragged him to the bench near the gate. I thought, if it looked like he fell alone, maybe it would stop the rest from unraveling. But the past doesn't unspool so easily, she said, especially when it's tied to a name no one dared speak. He didn't answer. She didn't expect him to. Some guilt needs no response, only space to rest. Back inside, Ruby was at the parlor window, watching the road. "He won't come back, will he?" she asked. "Mr. Longmore?" "He already has," Miss Marple replied. Not to hurt anyone, but to ask a question no one let him ask before. Ruby looked at her. "Do you think Margaret will speak to him again?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that Margaret has waited far too long to be silent now." Later that evening, the fog returned, but softer now, like a veil instead of a curtain. Margaret stood at the hallway mirror, brushing dust from the frame. The door to James' room remained ajar. Not wide, not ceremonious, just enough for light to pass through. And on the mantel, the soldier stood as he had before, chipped and bent, but upright. In another house, far from Denholm Terrace, Edwin Longmore packed his coat. He folded it carefully, laying a photograph atop it. A copy, recently printed, of James Denholm in uniform, smiling towards something just out of frame. He did not write a letter. He had no need to. The soldier on the mantel had said everything. The following morning arrived quietly, with a dull gray light that gave the house an expectant stillness. Miss Marple sat at the kitchen table as Ruby moved about, boiling water for linens rather than tea. Some tasks, Miss Marple thought, were less about utility and more about managing memory. Ruby, her voice uncertain, finally said, "It all feels heavier and lighter somehow. Like I know more, but I don't understand it." Miss Marple nodded gently. That's often what truth feels like. Not relief, just clarity. Upstairs, Margaret sat alone in James's old room, untouched since the war. The clock was missing, a silence she'd preserved for decades. She stared at the books, the desk, the coat that still hung quietly. It wasn't grief anymore. It was something older, something that no longer tried to resist itself. Miss Marple joined her. "You saw him," she said softly. "You knew." Margaret's hands tightened around the chair. "I did. I saw James in his eyes, but I was afraid that knowing meant I had failed him somehow." "There is no failure," Miss Marple said, "in seeing someone too late. Only the tragedy of not seeing them at all." The front bell rang. It was Edwin. No suitcase, just a small wooden box in his hands. Inside, James's medals, the old tin soldier, and a folded letter. "I didn't come to take anything," he said. "Only to hold it. Just once." Margaret approached, lifted the soldier gently, and looked at him. Really looked. "He gave this to you." Edwin nodded. "I remembered the toy more than I remembered him." "You remember him now," she whispered. Later, as he prepared to leave, Margaret gave him the unsent letter she had once written. "I never finished it," she said. Edwin held it with both hands. "You did," he replied. "You just didn't know it then." When the door closed behind him, the parlor felt lighter, not empty. The past had not disappeared. It had simply been acknowledged. And sometimes that was enough. The next morning, frost clung to the windows of the Denholm house, forming delicate white veins across the glass, like time etching its signature across the day. Miss Marple stood by the stairwell, her knitting untouched, her attention instead drawn to the sounds the house no longer made. No creaking floorboards, no distant cough from the landing, not even Ruby's habitual humming. Silence now meant something else, peace, tentative but real. She made her way through the garden path later that morning, the last of the leaves curling at her feet like brittle questions. The old gate at the far end stood ajar, something that hadn't happened in years. Ruby had once said it was always kept shut. "Not safe," she'd murmured. But now it opened as if the past had loosened its grip. Miss Marple reached the gate and rested her hand on its cold iron frame. Through it, the lane stretched out, narrow and flanked by bare hedges. She remembered what Edwin had said before leaving. "It's strange to come back and realize the place that shaped you never truly knew you were part of it." That gate, like the room upstairs, had never really been shut for safety. It had been shut for sorrow. Behind her, the house had begun to breathe again. Margaret had asked for fresh curtains to be opened, and Ruby had brought in a vase of lilies, without being asked. These weren't gestures of change. They were acknowledgments that the story was no longer paused. In the early afternoon, Miss Marple visited the village archives, tucked behind the church. She requested the old local papers from 1943 to 1945, and after some time, she found what she was looking for. A small notice, printed without prominence, read, "Infant boy placed in care following mother's hospitalization. Paternal name withheld." Below it, a quiet list of administrative approvals, one bearing the name, Alfred Longmore. The paper trembled in her hand not because of what it said, but because of what it confirmed, what Edwin had never dared say aloud. He had not returned for vengeance. He had returned to understand why the world had made him invisible. That evening, Miss Marple sat again in the Denholm parlor. The tin soldier still stood on the mantel, not moved, not polished, not fussed over. Its worn paint and crooked foot made it no less noble. In fact, it seemed to her that it had always been waiting, silent and patient, for the day it would be seen as more than just a toy. Margaret sat beside her with a blanket across her knees, her hands folded in her lap. "It was always there," she said, barely above a whisper. "The knowing. I just didn't want to reach for it." "You've reached now," Miss Marple said gently. "And so has he." The clock ticked softly. No chimes, no fanfare, just the sound of time moving again. The air in the Denholm house was beginning to shift. Not dramatically, not like a window thrown open or a fire suddenly rekindled, but like the soft sigh of a room beginning to breathe again. Miss Marple sat near the window with her knitting untouched in her lap, her gaze fixed not on the garden path or the hearth, but on the silence itself. It was no longer the silence of something suppressed. It was the kind that follows after a name has finally been spoken aloud. Margaret moved slowly these days, as though each step was part of an old dance she was relearning. She no longer flinched at the sound of the gate. She no longer asked Ruby to keep the curtains drawn. Instead, she had begun to speak James's name again, softly, with the reverence of someone dusting off a memory that had long been stored away. One afternoon, while Ruby trimmed lavender sprigs outside, Miss Marple opened the old wooden chest in the hallway, the one Margaret had refused to touch for years. Inside, folded neatly and without moth holes, were James's childhood clothes, a pair of reading glasses, and an envelope that had been hidden beneath the lining. It was addressed in James's handwriting, "To my son, if ever he should ask." The letter was not long. It spoke of regret, of duty, of a war that had taken more than it returned. James wrote of a boy he never met, but hoped would one day find his way back. "If you read this," the letter said, "I want you to know that I was proud of your mother for keeping you safe. And if she couldn't tell you everything, it was only because the world was louder than her voice. I never forgot you." Miss Marple showed it to Margaret that evening. The older woman read the letter in silence, then pressed it against her chest. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew all along." Later that week, Ruby found Edwin's name etched faintly into the underside of James's old desk. Not carved with anger, but placed there gently, just initials and a date, like a boy trying to prove he existed. Margaret asked Ruby to bring a photograph framed down from the attic. She placed Edwin's boyhood picture in it, beside James's uniform portrait, and did not say a word. But Miss Marple saw the moment for what it was, a reunion not of bodies, but of truths. A home was beginning to remember all of its family. Miss Marple spent one final evening at Denholm House before her return to St. Mary Mead. The fog had begun to thin along the garden paths, and the old gate no longer creaked with dread. As she stood once more in the drawing room, the tin soldier still upright on the mantel, she gently adjusted its position, just slightly, so it faced the window. And in that moment, with the fire low and the quiet warm rather than cold, she knew the past had not been erased. It had been recognized, and that was enough. The morning of Miss Marple's departure was crisp and unusually clear. The fog that had long blanketed Denholm Terrace, inside and out, seemed to have retreated, not vanquished but satisfied. The sun cut gently across the hedgerows, lighting the path between the garden gate and the old Denholm house with soft, golden strokes, as though trying to bless what had finally been named and known. Miss Marple rose early, not from restlessness, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finished a difficult puzzle, not with a flourish, but with care. In the kitchen, Ruby was already preparing tea. She didn't ask Miss Marple if she'd slept well. She didn't need to. The house itself felt different, like a place no longer holding its breath. Margaret came down a little later. She wore her son's scarf, loosely draped over her shoulders, not as mourning, but remembrance. She greeted Miss Marple not with pleasantries, but with a soft, genuine thank you, and handed her a parcel tied in green ribbon. "Just a few of his letters," she said. "He would have wanted you to keep something." Miss Marple, touched, accepted the parcel with both hands and a slight bow of the head. "Sometimes," she said gently, "the most precious part of memory is simply knowing someone else carries it too." Before she left, she took one last quiet walk through the house. She paused by the mantel, where the tin soldier still stood. Its paint was cracked, its one leg still slightly bent, but it stood now not as a relic of pain, but as a token of presence, of return, of resilience. She stepped into James's old room one last time. It had not been tidied or rearranged, only opened, and that was enough. The light spilled in across the desk, and over the photograph, now joined by another frame, Edwin's. Two men, once divided by silence, now resting side by side in memory. As Miss Marple walked down the garden path, Mr. Albee was pruning near the roses. He looked up, gave a brief nod, and returned to his work. There was no need for words between them. Some roles in life, gardener, witness, protector, were understood best without conversation. At the station, as the train arrived in a low hum of steel and breath, Miss Marple glanced one final time at the village beyond the platform. Denholm House, no longer a place of locked doors and unsaid names, seemed to sit a little straighter on the horizon. She boarded the train with her gloves neatly folded, her suitcase light, and her heart, for once, unburdened. As the countryside blurred past the window, she thought of the boy with the tin soldier, the man who came home without fanfare, and the mother who had waited not for justice, but for recognition. In the end, there had been no grand trial, no headlines, no punishments. Just a door unlocked, a truth spoken aloud, and a family that had finally allowed the past to step into the light. And as the morning sun warmed the windows of her carriage, Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be remembered.